The city woke before the sun fully rose. Motorbikes coughed awake, buses groaned, and voices floated through the morning air like restless birds. Tall concrete towers stood proudly, their glass windows catching the early light, while just beside them lay old family compounds with cracked walls and rusted gates. These homes had seen generations, births, burials, weddings, and prayers whispered to the earth. Now they lived in the shadows of modern buildings that seemed to grow taller every year. Elders sitting on wooden stools often shook their heads and said, "When the new tree grows too fast, it forgets the soil that feeds it." In this city, tradition and modern power stood face to face, each watching the other without greeting. Among these towers stood one building that did not blend in. It was surrounded by a high fence topped with sharp metal, like teeth ready to bite. The gate was always locked, even during the day, and a watchful eye followed anyone who passed too slowly. Inside, the paint was clean and the walls were strong. Outside, the road was dusty, and children played barefoot near broken drains. The fence did more than protect property, it drew a line. On one side stood comfort and control. On the other stood struggle and waiting. People often said the building looked less like a home and more like a warning. "That place is not for people like us," a woman once whispered as she pulled her child closer. The building had not always been ruled with such hardness. It once belonged to a man who greeted tenants with a smile and believed a house was a shelter, not a throne. When he died, the keys passed into his wife's hands. Grief came first, then fear, and finally hunger for control. Ownership became her shield against the world. Instead of seeing responsibility, she saw power. Each door she owned made her feel taller. Each rent payment fed her belief that she stood above others. The house hardened her heart, brick by brick, until she could no longer remember the woman she used to be. Her name traveled faster than her footsteps. People spoke it only when necessary, and even then, they lowered their voices. In the market, traders warned newcomers, "Be careful if you rent from her." In the compound, tenants avoided her path, pressing their backs to walls when she passed. She scolded without mercy and shamed without care. Once, when a young man begged for more time to pay, she laughed and said, "Poverty is not my problem." Fear followed her like a shadow at noon, short, dark, and impossible to escape. To her, money was not just wealth, it was proof. Proof that the ancestors favored her. Proof that she was wiser than those who struggled. She often said, "If I were wrong, would I be rich?" In her eyes, payment replaced compassion, and success replaced morality. Tenants were not people with stories. They were numbers. Paid guests were even less, temporary bodies with no voice. She believed power was a blessing meant to be used, not questioned. And as elders would later say, when someone mistakes wealth for wisdom, the fall is already walking toward them, even if they cannot yet hear its steps. The sun had climbed higher, but its light felt heavy as a lone figure appeared at the entrance of the fenced building. He carried no suitcase, no bag, only a small bundle tied tightly in cloth. His steps were careful, measured, as if each footfall might awaken the eyes that watched from the windows above. Passers-by murmured to one another. "Who is he?" asked a woman selling roasted maize. "A stranger," another whispered, pulling her child closer. The man's eyes lowered, his shoulders bent not from weakness but from the weight of unseen burdens, family left behind, debts unpaid, and memories that clung like shadows. Inside, he paused at the gate, observing the towering fence, the cold walls, and the stern stare of the landlady perched on the balcony above. She narrowed her eyes, scrutinizing him as though she could measure his worth by the look of his worn clothes. "Another one," she muttered to herself. "Just another poor soul to keep in line." But the man's silence was steady, unshaken. Beneath his plain appearance lay a strength that only years of patience and the wisdom of elders could have forged. He remembered the words his grandmother had whispered, "The river may seem still, but it carves the hardest stone." The courtyard seemed alive with invisible watchers. Tenants peeked from behind curtains, elders' proverbs echoing in their minds. Pride may climb high, but humility builds the lasting home. They had seen many come and go, most bowed and broken by the landlady's sharp tongue. Yet there was something in the stranger's quiet that unsettled even the bravest neighbors. They said nothing, afraid of the consequences, yet their eyes followed him, absorbing each step, each measured pause. The landlady finally spoke, her voice sharp as iron. You there! Who sent you to my house? You look helpless. Are you sure you can pay? Her words dripped with judgment, her tone assuming weakness before it could even be tested. She saw a shadow in his lowered eyes, a bundle too small to carry hope, and made her conclusion, another one to dominate, to belittle, to control. She had no inkling that silence could hide patience, humility could carry strength, and a stranger could carry the seeds of justice that even she would one day fear. The man met her gaze briefly, calm and unafraid, and then continued inside, leaving a trail of quiet dignity in his wake. Around him, the courtyard held its breath. In African tales, it was often the quiet river that overpowered the raging storm. And so the stage was set. What appeared weak and simple might soon change the balance of power, as the elder's words whispered on the wind, "Do not mistake silence for weakness, nor humility for surrender. Fate watches the patient closely." The landlady's voice rang across the courtyard like a drum announcing war. "Move quickly. Do not dawdle. Keep your rooms clean, or face the consequences." Her fingers pointed sharply at tenants as she paced along the balcony, her heels clicking against the concrete like thunder. Every glance from her eyes carried judgment, every word demanded obedience. She was power made flesh, an authority that brooked no question, no hesitation. Below, the paid guest stood with calm shoulders, eyes lowered, and hands folded lightly in front. Silence was his shield, quiet, his resistance. He did not flinch, did not mutter, but the elder's teachings whispered through him, "The river flows gently but carves the valley deep." The tenants watched from behind cracked windows and rusted gates. No one spoke. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The landlady's presence was a weight pressing down on them all. She circled the courtyard, inspecting rooms and murmuring complaints loud enough for all to hear. "This mat is dusty. This floor is uneven. Are you blind or lazy?" Her words stung, slicing pride from even the strongest. Every morning became a test, a ritual of shame designed to remind everyone that power was hers and submission was theirs. The paid guest listened, absorbing the cruelty without reaction, letting the sound wash over him like rain over stone, temporary, but shaping what lay beneath. Coins were counted with meticulous cruelty. Each payment handed over felt heavier than the last, weighed down by rules that existed only to punish. "You forgot the water bill," she barked, flipping through papers as if searching for sin. "And the light. You must pay double." Her ledger was a weapon, her pen a dagger. Every extra coin demanded was a lesson, and every unjust fine left small scars in the spirit. Yet he gave quietly, not from fear but from patience. He remembered the elders saying, "Do not strike at the snake in the grass. Wait, and it will reveal its own fangs." Day after day, the balance of power was clear, loud dominance against quiet endurance, but the moral ground beneath them was shifting, and fate was already watching from the edges of the courtyard, unseen but attentive, waiting for the moment when pride would stumble and patience would rise. The air inside the building was thick with tension, heavier than the midday sun pressing against the walls. Every day, the landlady reminded tenants and paid guests of their precarious place. "If your rent is late again, you will find yourself on the street before nightfall," she snapped, her voice carrying across the courtyard like a bell tolling doom. The threat of eviction hung over the residents like a curse, an invisible chain that clinked softly in every step they took. Elders in the village had long whispered, "He who rules with terror plants fear, but harvests nothing but ashes." Each warning she gave planted that fear deeper, shaping the lives of those who dared to live beneath her roof. From behind cracked windows and rusty gates, neighbors watched silently, their eyes wide but their lips sealed. They saw every scolding, every unfair fine, every humiliation inflicted on the new paid guest. Some clenched their fists, others pressed their children close, yet none dared speak. Survival demanded obedience. Justice waited quietly, unclaimed. In their silence, the community carried the weight of stories untold, of wrongs observed but unchallenged, each person's heart beating like a drum warning of danger, yet knowing that the sound of dissent could cost more than it could save. For the paid guest, the building was not a home. Its walls were cold, its floor hard, its corridors echoing with judgment. Even as he walked softly to his room, each step reminded him that he had no roots here, no claim beyond the thin contract of payment. He was a visitor in a land of power and fear, a stranger whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. Every glance from the landlady, every whisper among tenants, reinforced his place as an outsider, an invisible mark stamped upon him that said, "You do not belong." The lessons of the neighborhood were clear. Years of fear and silence had trained every resident to bow quickly before loud authority. Doors were shut faster, eyes lowered earlier, footsteps shortened in anticipation of sharp words. Children learned quickly. Voices are tools of survival, not instruments of justice. And so, injustice thrived not because it was right, but because everyone had been taught to obey before thinking of consequences. The landlady's power fed on this culture, growing taller with each bow and glance cast downward. Yet, in the quiet of the night, the paid guest found solace in the whispers of ancestors that floated through memory and dream. He remembered his grandmother's words, "The tree that bends with the wind will stand longer than the one that breaks." He remembered his father's warning, "Patience is the silent river that shapes mountains." He carried these voices in his heart as he lay awake under the thin roof, feeling the tension of the day seep into his bones. The city slept, the building loomed, but within him, endurance grew. Strength was quiet, invisible, yet unyielding. He knew that silence did not mean weakness, and that true power could wait, gathering like a river behind the dam, until the moment it would move mountains. The paid guest sat quietly on the edge of his narrow mat, the evening sun painting long shadows across the courtyard. In his mind, memories of his parents stirred like wind through old trees. His mother's voice came softly from years ago, "Strength is not in shouting, my child, but in holding the fire inside without letting it burn the wrong path." His father's hands, worn from labor, had rested on his shoulder with the same wisdom, "Do not rush the river, for it will carry stones at its own pace." These lessons had shaped him, teaching patience, humility, and the quiet courage to endure without raising his voice against the storm of cruelty that surrounded him. He believed in the slow march of justice, a faith carried in African hearts for generations. "Fate remembers," he whispered to himself, recalling the elders saying, "even when the world forgets." Each act of wrongdoing by the landlady, every unfair fine or public humiliation, would be balanced in its time. The river of morality flowed, invisible but inevitable. He understood that resistance did not always roar. Sometimes it waited, gathering strength beneath the surface, until the moment it could sweep away injustice without spilling its own honor. The iron gates of the building clanged behind him, louder than any voice could have shouted, signaling boundaries that were both physical and symbolic. Each lock, each metal bar, was a reminder of confinement, a warning to those who dared move beyond their prescribed place. Yet he moved within these limits with care, stepping lightly, aware that every space he occupied belonged to both his endurance and his observance. Broken lights flickered in the hallways, and the roof leaked in quiet streams onto the floor below. These signs of neglect whispered of lives forgotten, of humanity ignored by the one who claimed authority. The landlady's wealth had built walls, but it had not built care. The paid guest saw these flaws and felt the weight of responsibility, not to claim ownership, but to honor what others had lost. In the corners of the courtyard, he left small acts of kindness. A bucket of water for an elderly tenant, a piece of bread shared with a child who had none, a whispered word of encouragement to those whose voices were silenced. Each act was quiet, unnoticed by the landlady, yet they planted seeds of hope where cruelty reigned. Slowly, like drops of rain on dry soil, these gestures reminded the community that compassion could survive even in the shadow of power. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, he felt the fire inside him burn steadily, a promise that patience, wisdom, and small acts of courage could one day bend even the hardest heart. The landlady's voice cut sharper than a machete that morning. "Why is this floor wet? Do you think I will allow laziness under my roof?" she shouted, her fingers jabbing at the tiles as if trying to pierce the ground itself. The paid guest lowered his eyes, silent, watching as her fury spilled over boundaries no rule had ever set. She tore through his small belongings, mocked his meager possessions, and laughed as if cruelty were a celebration rather than a sin. Each insult and threat weighed heavily, pressing upon him like the sun on dry earth. The walls that should have been shelter had become a proving ground for her pride. Hope shrank within him, a fragile ember threatened by wind. Each new rule, each unfair accusation, felt like a knife carving doubt and despair into his spirit. He thought of his family, their lessons echoing in his mind. Even the smallest flame can survive the storm if you do not snuff it out yourself. He drew in slow breaths, counting each one like beads on a prayer chain. Strength was not loud, it was measured. And in this quiet endurance, He held on to the belief that justice, though delayed, never forgot. The courtyard seemed to hold its own breath. Neighbors peeked behind curtains, muttered prayers under their breath, and exchanged quick glances. They had seen this display countless times before, and each time someone had faltered, the landlady had grown taller in her power. Today, they waited for the paid guest to falter, to crumble, to become another tale of despair whispered in the night. But he remained still, eyes lowered, silence his shield. The community's expectation hung in the air like ripe fruit, ready to fall, but it would not fall yet. Silence shifted in meaning. What once seemed meek now carried weight, like the shadow of a lion passing through the tall grass. The paid guest listened differently, observed with intent, and let no word of the landlady's cruelty pass unnoted. Every misstep, every glance of arrogance, was a thread to be followed, not a weapon to fear. He began to feel the power of his own quiet, how it could hold, wait, and witness the truth as it unfolded without alerting the wrongdoer. His eyes opened wider, ears sharper. The patterns of her cruelty revealed themselves: favoritism toward certain tenants, false complaints to justify fines, the tiny cracks in her carefully constructed authority. Secrets whispered in passing conversations, lies told to inflate her importance, and acts of hypocrisy that no one dared challenge. They were all there, waiting to be gathered like water in a dry calabash. He saw the fragile foundation of her power, and a plan began to form silently within him, untraceable to any watcher. At night, when the courtyard slept under the quiet gaze of the moon, he took his first deliberate step. No one noticed. No footfall betrayed his intent. He moved softly, checking locks, observing routines, noting what could be used and when. Patience guided him, each motion considered, each action deliberate. The beginnings of change often begin in silence, and he had learned that well from the elders who had raised him. And while he moved quietly, fate itself stirred. The currents of justice shifted imperceptibly, bending toward balance. The landlady, blinded by pride and her own laughter, could not see it. Her arrogance painted her world in colors of certainty, leaving her blind to the coming tide. Somewhere in the shadows, in the quiet corners of her kingdom of fear, the scales began to tip. Fate turned its face, unnoticed, yet inevitable, and the first tremors of reckoning were already in motion. The landlady sat in her high-backed chair, counting coins as if each one were a crown on her head. "Money speaks," she declared, voice rising like a drumbeat across the courtyard. "Where wealth exists, conscience is a whisper no one needs to hear." Her eyes scanned the tenants below, measuring them with the precision of a merchant weighing gold. To her, success had hardened the heart once soft with the lessons of ancestors. Morality was no longer a guide, it was optional, a tool to be ignored when convenient. She believed the weight of her purse outweighed the weight of her actions, and she ruled accordingly. Once, she had knelt at her grandmother's feet, listening to stories of respect, patience, and the sacred duties owed to one's neighbors. Now, those traditions were nothing more than dust on shelves, ignored and dismissed. She spat on the teachings she had inherited. Humility was weakness, compassion a liability. The festivals of the village, the prayers at dawn, the council of elders, all were relics she viewed as irrelevant, for her riches made her above such concerns. Humility, once honored, now invited scorn. She mistook quiet respect and gentle behavior for inferiority, and feared anyone who would not bow visibly before her. "You stand too straight," she barked one morning. "Do you think I am weak because I see you unbent?" Her obsession with appearances and power blinded her to the strength that lived quietly in others, especially the new paid guest who walked softly through her domain. Under the same roof, two worlds collided. Pride reigned above, loud and ostentatious, every step of the landlady a declaration of dominance. Below, patience lived, measured and unyielding. The paid guest moved silently, carrying neither anger nor the need for display. He observed, he listened, he endured. The contrast was stark. One woman used wealth as a weapon, while one man used restraint as his armor. Even as he obeyed the rules imposed upon him, the paid guest honored the elders and the unseen spirits that governed the land. He whispered the prayers taught to him by his parents, bowed in respect where respect was due, and tended quietly to neighbors who needed help. In this, he found a shield against the chaos of tyranny, a strength that money could not buy and cruelty could not break. The power above him was loud, but the wisdom below was steady, and in that steadiness lay the first seeds of what was to come. The morning sun rose over the courtyard, spilling light on the worn tiles and broken edges of the landlady's grand building. Birds perched on the fence seemed to pause, their chirps quiet, as if listening. In the soft rustle of leaves, the paid guest felt a presence, not of human eyes, but of the ancestors watching. Each footstep, each careless word, was noted by forces unseen. When the landlady snapped at a tenant for a minor delay, the wind carried a faint whisper through the hallways, a gentle caution against cruelty. Fate, quiet and patient, observed all. Elders from the neighborhood gathered at the well, speaking softly as they always did. "A tree that bends not will one day snap under its own weight," one said, and another replied, "Gold without heart will rust in silence." Their words drifted across the streets like dust, unnoticed by the landlady but sinking into the soul of the paid guest. He remembered his father's voice, "The proud will stumble on their own shadow, the patient will inherit the calm river." Each proverb carried a warning, indirect yet piercing, guiding him to see the cracks in arrogance. Laughter once followed the landlady like a loyal companion. Now it grew thin, fragile, and hesitant. Tenants no longer whispered admiration when she passed, and even visitors lingered at the edges of her authority, unsure whether to obey or avoid. A once-adored figure now found her presence heavy, hollow. The paid guest noticed how quickly her smiles faltered, how her eyes sought validation where none remained, and how silence replaced the applause she had expected. Even her shadow seemed to shy away, elongating awkwardly across the courtyard walls as if afraid of joining her. Those who had once bowed readily now gave space, moved cautiously, and avoided eye contact. Fear had replaced loyalty. Whispers of dissent and quiet dissatisfaction threaded through the tenants' routines. The landlady's power, once magnetic, now pushed away everything that should have supported it, leaving her alone in her fortress of wealth. Inside the house, subtle betrayals began to stir. Her own family, emboldened by greed and embittered by years of harsh treatment, plotted quietly to take advantage of her wealth. Relatives requested favors under the guise of loyalty. Allies offered advice that served only their pockets. The paid guest observed it all with quiet eyes, noticing the tension behind forced smiles and hushed conversations. In every small act of exploitation, in every silent sigh of resentment, the building itself seemed to murmur warnings. Power taken without compassion invites decay, and those who rule through fear may find themselves abandoned by the closest hearts. Those who had once extended hands to lift her to prominence now lingered silently, waiting for a misstep. Relatives, friends, and long-trusted allies exchanged subtle glances across the courtyard. Their smiles were brittle, their words layered with hidden intent. Every favor once freely given had been repaid with loyalty. Now, loyalty was scarce and patience thin. The paid guest watched as these hands, once instruments of her ascent, rested quietly in anticipation, and a quiet tension hummed through the walls. Fate seemed to linger in the spaces between them, waiting for the inevitable. The landlady tightened her grip on every rule, every coin, every gesture of authority. She paced through hallways like a lion claiming the savannah, her eyes sharp, voice sharper. Yet in her obsession, she failed to notice the subtle cracks around her. Whispers behind closed doors, the careful avoidance of her gaze, the shifting loyalties, all were signs she could not see. Control had become a blinder, shielding her from reality while sharpening her arrogance. "I am the one who rules here," she would say aloud, louder each day, unaware that walls were beginning to close in. Inside, the paid guest felt a surge of anger that burned like dry grass in the midday sun. The humiliation, the unfair charges, the cruel words, they rattled against his patience, tempting him to strike back, to speak loudly, to break the balance he had so carefully maintained. "Enough!" he whispered one night, his voice trembling with emotion. "How much more must one endure?" The fire of human frustration flared, and he felt the dangerous thrill of retaliation. Then he remembered the voices of his elders, echoing like rivers over stones in the quiet of his mind. "Do not rush the river, child. Its waters carry both vengeance and wisdom. Patience brings the truth to light." The words wrapped around him, steadying the storm of emotion. He recalled the faces of his parents, the stories of ancestors who endured injustices greater than his, and who waited for fate to act in its own time. With a deep breath, he chose silence. Not as surrender, not as weakness, but as strategy. Every insult, every humiliation, became a stone he stored in the chest of his resolve. He smiled politely, bowed quietly, and moved through the landlady's domain without giving her the satisfaction of anger returned. Strength settled in his chest like a drumbeat, patient, unyielding, hidden yet undeniable. He would endure, and when the moment was right, the balance would shift, not by noise, but by the quiet force of justice. Even in the heart of the bustling city, where concrete towers rose like trophies over ancestral soil, there existed a power that spoke louder than any voice. The landlady commanded with a booming authority that rattled walls and hearts alike. Every instruction, every decree, carried the weight of gold and fear. Yet in the shadowed corners, quiet strength took root. The paid guest moved through the halls with soft steps, a calm patience that did not seek attention. His silence was not emptiness, it was a seed, growing slowly, unseen, but unyielding. Fate stirred gently, shifting the ground beneath the landlady's feet while she remained fixed in arrogance. The doors she had barred, the rules she had forged, the loyalty she had assumed, each trembled with the first signs of imbalance. Windows reflected her power, but the reflections began to crack. The walls whispered stories of injustice, and tradition, long ignored, began to reclaim its voice. Elders' proverbs floated in the wind, even the tallest tree bends in the storm. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for pride to meet consequence. The day came when silence could no longer carry the weight of truth. Small cruelties, carefully hidden, now strained against secrecy. Coins counted unfairly, words spoken to humiliate, doors slammed to intimidate, all pressed against the fragile veneer of control. Rumors, once mere whispers, began to ripple. Neighbors glanced at each other, hesitant but knowing. Those whispers became witnesses before the entire community. Mothers paused in courtyards, elders shook their heads knowingly, and young men stopped mid-step, hearing truths that could no longer be denied. "She cannot hide it forever," someone muttered, voice trembling with relief and fear. The mask slipped. The landlady's face, once sharp with pride and carefully curated for public admiration, faltered. Her cruelty, her greed, her arrogance, all lay bare for those who had long suffered under her shadow. Eyes widened in shock, murmurs rose, and the carefully constructed image of infallible power fractured like dry clay. And finally, the eyes that once looked away now refused to close. The community watched in quiet awe, the collective witness an unspoken judgment. No longer could fear silence them. The truth had become undeniable, echoing through hallways, courtyards, and the minds of all who had suffered. The balance, long tipped, began its slow, inevitable restoration. The courtyard, once heavy with whispered fear and trembling glances, fell silent. The paid guest, who had moved like a shadow for months, stepped forward. His eyes met the landlady's with calm clarity. No tremor in his voice, no flare of anger, only a measured resolve that seemed to pull the air from the room. "Enough," he said softly, yet the words struck with the weight of a river breaking its banks. Fear began to retreat from those gathered. The tenants straightened, their hidden strength rising like sap in a long-neglected tree. Silence had become dignity, humility now carrying the power that arrogance had thought absolute. Even the youngest children watched with wide, unblinking eyes, sensing the shift in the air. The landlady's face paled. Her pride, the armor she had worn for decades, showed cracks that she could no longer hide. You dare," she stammered, voice catching as the realization settled too late. She had crushed those she thought weak, yet this one bore patience and strength where she had sowed fear. Shock spread like a drumbeat across the square. Voices stilled mid-word, eyes widened, hands paused. The community, long shackled by intimidation, now sensed the turn of fate. Murmurs rose in disbelief, as if the walls themselves were gasping at the reversal. Shame struck deeper than any barrier of brick or title. The landlady's golden gates, once symbols of untouchable authority, could no longer hide the emptiness beneath. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of respect lost. Her name now murmured not with awe, but with pity. One by one, the crowd shifted. Backs straightened, heads lifted, and the whispered allegiance to fear dissolved. They turned away from arrogance, following the quiet strength that had spoken without raising a voice. Justice, long patient, walked openly among them, guided not by fury, but by the dignity of one who had endured. The courtyard, once tense with whispered fear, held its breath. Justice moved quietly, like the river that erodes stone without anger. No raised voice, no retribution born of hate, only the natural turning of fate. The landlady, who had believed herself untouchable, now felt the weight of every deed, every cruel command she had issued, settling around her like dust from an old, forgotten roof. Her keys and ledgers, symbols of control for years, now felt like chains. Every coin counted, every rule enforced, every locked gate and stern glance, it all circled back to her, a mirror of the power she had wielded without mercy. She stumbled through her rooms, seeing the tools of dominance transform into instruments of exposure. Pride, once a crown upon her head, began to crack. Her laughter, which had echoed with intimidation, faltered and fell silent. Mirrors reflected a woman unmasked, hollowed by the very truths she had denied. No cries mocked her fall, yet it resounded louder than any shout. The tenants, neighbors, and even the timid children bore witness, eyes wide, hearts steady, remembering how silence had given way to truth. The clamor of authority faded like wind over dry grass. What remained was the inevitability of consequence, social, emotional, and legal, descending gently but firmly. In the hush that followed, all who watched understood. Power without compassion cannot endure, and destiny, patient and impartial, always balances the scales. The landlady moved through her house, head lowered as though the walls themselves whispered her failures. The crown of authority she had worn so proudly now felt heavy and hollow. No fanfare, no ceremony, just the quiet unraveling of power she had assumed eternal. The neighbors peeked from behind curtains, seeing a woman who had ruled through fear now humbled by the weight of her own deeds. For the first time in many seasons, the steps that had once commanded obedience now met only empty hallways. Fear, the companion that had shadowed her every demand, had vanished. Whispers no longer bowed, glances no longer dropped. She was alone in the echo of her arrogance. The paid guest, standing near the open courtyard gate, did not raise a hand nor shout a word. Yet respect flowed toward him, carried by the eyes of all who had watched silently for so long. His patience, his restraint, and his quiet endurance had earned the acknowledgment that violence or loud protest never could. A deep sigh filled the courtyard, not of defeat, but of restored balance. Peace settled where anger had once threatened to erupt. The tension that had gripped every corner loosened, and the air felt lighter, freer. Slowly, voices returned. Tenants exchanged greetings, laughter sparked like morning light over worn rooftops, and neighbors began speaking again without fear. The courtyard, once heavy with silence, now hummed with life, a testament to courage rooted in patience and the enduring truth that justice, tempered with wisdom, always finds its way. The courtyard breathed a new rhythm, where wealth no longer towered over human dignity, and gold bowed to the weight of conscience. The tenants moved freely, their voices mingling with the soft hum of the evening breeze. Coins were counted fairly, meals shared without fear, and the air itself seemed lighter, carrying the scent of restored balance. In this place, money walked beside morality, and the community felt whole once more. An elder stepped forward, cane tapping softly on the worn stones. "Remember," he said, voice steady and deep, "power without compassion destroys itself. Silence is not weakness. Those who trample others invite the correction of fate. Let this be your guide, as it was ours, through the ages." The landlady stood quietly, her eyes lowered, no words left to fight the truth that had found her. The paid guest smiled softly, not with triumph, but with the calm of one who had endured and learned the lessons of patience and restraint. As night fell, dust settled over the courtyard, and the old roofs glimmered in the last light. Yet memory remained, etched in every stone, every whispered proverb, and every gaze that now knew the value of justice. The elder's wisdom had once again proven true, and the story would be carried forward, living in the hearts of all who had seen pride fall and humility rise.